Where we left off, we went over a few things that I think are of kind of general truth in the United States that we got today. That's one of the reasons why I'm interested in the Vietnam topic, even though this war happened a long time ago. In the grand scheme of things, it was a relatively secondary war, and most of you all are too young to really have much of a memory or really an exposure to it, except for maybe parents or grandparents who might be veterans. But this war showed a number of things which are still true today, which are of real importance. One is it shows the innate kind of tension in the 14-point system. The 14-point system, remember, says that the peoples of the world should be able to control their own destiny. They should have self determination. But it also says that, implies that if you look at the world differently than the United States, you're the next rogue who's out to start the next war. So the innate tension is what happens if the local people decide they want to be radically different than the United States. You saw that with nations that chose communism or communist style movements in the 20th century, and you see that today with Islamic fundamentalism. That is what happens if a nation chooses a religious government or something like that. Second thing is we saw in the last class is that this tension is often incorrectly presented to the United States, to the people of the United States. That is, the government tends to project these as the radicals are foreign sponsored, whereas the ordinary people favor what the Americans want. Usually it's the other way around. That is, as we saw last time. The communists actually grew from the ground up in Vietnam. They were the people who spent a great deal of time and effort into building organically, to build from the villages outward. It's the American supported side, even if they have a lot of popular support within the nation, even majority support, generally tend to be imposed from the United States. That is, they have leaders that were picked by the United States. They have a governmental structure that was designed by the United States. They have militaries that were trained by the United States. So they have American style organization system, American style tactics, whether or not they fit the customs of the country or not. So you see those two things that are common. Okay, that is the tension of the 14 points, the presentation of these types of tension to the American public. The third is the whole idea of Revolutionary People's War. That is, Revolutionary People's War is a strategy that is used all the time. The Vietnamese communists were going to try to use this against the United States in this war, and as we shall see effectively. But if you go into today, you look at, say, the Taliban, you looked into Iraq a few years ago with the war there, you see variants of Revolutionary People's War being used everywhere. It is a set of tactics that works for a side that is less powerful in equipment, in money, and even in manpower. Right? And it is something that the United States military has to learn how to deal with because they're seeing it all the time. The final thing that we went over in the last class that I think is still around, and so I want to use that as a building block to this one, is that the United States military, when the United States decides on a military solution, is limited in what they could do because they are limited by the international and domestic political environment. And they can't do things that will make the situation worse. And we saw the limits that that put on Lyndon Johnson and what he could do militarily in the Vietnam War in the close of your last class. If sending your soldiers over into Pakistan to start the Taliban gets you into a bigger war, then you're going to order your men not to do it, so on and so forth. So, with all that in mind, say you are a military officer, you are a general in the Army or in the Marine Corps. The president tells you, win this war for me in Vietnam. How can you win it? And let's see some of the things that they tried. And let's start by looking at the ability part. As the United States military went through a number of efforts to try to break the ability of the communists to win the war. And they thought that the strategic heart of their effort would be this area here in red. This is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a series of trails that uh, roadways that went from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. They went through the neighboring nations of Laos and Cambodia. And on this trail network, the communists brought supplies to their forces in the South. They brought reinforcements. They brought weapons. So the United States believed that if you could break this trail, that is, if you could make it impossible for the enemy to get supplies down this network, then you win the war. The question is how to do this. And the United States made a number of attempts to try. The first big attempt they made involved the use of air power. Basically, they thought they could bomb the trail into submission. They sent waves of bombers over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in order to try to shut the trail down. And you could imagine that that would be pretty effective, because after all, imagine trying to drive to work and a bomb drops on the highway in front of you. I would stop. So the United States started a series of bomber campaigns designed to shut down the trail. Probably the biggest one of those was something called Operation Linebacker, where they sent a bunch of bombers to drop a bunch of bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The communists, however, were able to come up with a countermeasure to this. It is a sophisticated piece of technology called a bicycle. That is, what they did was they took a ton of supplies and strapped them to a bicycle. They then gave each bicycle to a soldier and told the soldiers to walk to South Vietnam, carrying their supplies on the bicycle. They then dared the United States to hit a man on a bicycle from 35,000 feet. Right? The United States couldn't do that. Basically, they overestimated what their air power could do. Particularly, they overestimated the accuracy of their air power. Uh, at 1965, an accurate bomber could put a bomb within a half a mile radius of its target. Right? So if the bomber is aiming at a building on Lone Star College, it would the bomb would actually hit somewhere between Highway 249 and the far parking lot. That is a pretty broad spectrum. So that makes it hard to hit something this small. So the communists were able to keep on bringing supplies down the trails. The American bombers couldn't really interfere with it. Actually, the communists actually started playing mind game with those bombers. They set up once a fake trail. That is, they put over their fake vehicles and dared the Americans to bomb it. The Americans did. What the Americans were actually bombing was a supply of gravel. So once the American bombs hit that baked in gravel, it wound up in smaller pieces. The communists then shoveled the gravel in and then used that to expand the road network. And you can see that over the course of the war. When 1959, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was just a series of kind of footpaths that went through the jungle. By 1973, it was a paved highway. Right? They could bring motor vehicles down it. They actually brought trucks full of supplies. And also, the communists claimed that they didn't really need the trail for supplies anyway, because they said that they could support their armies through the local communities. That is, the local communities, the villages where they organized politically, would feed the soldiers, and they could get weapons and ammunition from stuff they captured from the southern armies, from the non-communist armies. To a large extent, that was their propaganda, but they weren't as reliant on the Ho Chi Minh Trail as the Americans like to believe, and American bombing couldn't shut the trail down anyway. So if bombing can't shut down the trails, then what can? And for that, the Americans tried something that is relatively new in its use of warfare, and that is science. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. It went around the world and beeped and scared the hell out of the United States. because the United States realized that if you could put a satellite into orbit and have it beep on a radio signal, you could put a bomb into orbit, or worse, you could put a bomb on the other side of the world. Right? So the Soviet use of launch of Sputnik frightened the United States and led to the development of a great deal of emphasis on science and technology in order to, from their perspective, catch up with the Soviets. And the American military, by the time you get the late into the 50s, was interested in technology anyway. Because from an American perspective, World War II, the last major war they fought, was ended by a science project, the atomic bomb. Right? In actuality, that wasn't true. Conventional military forces defeated Germany and the Germany and Japan. The atomic bomb was just kind of the frosting on the cake. But what's important is that the American military leadership believed it, the American government believed it, the American public believed it. So the United States was going to put a strong emphasis on developing new military technology. They believed that military technology was the key to war in the future. So after the Soviet launch of Sputnik, Congress authorized the creation of a program called ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Administration. Today it's called DARPA, for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration. If any of you are conspiracy nuts, you might have run into DARPA on the various interwebs. But DARPA was created as a way to kind of speed up the development of military technology. What the Army, the Air Force, the Marines, the Navy were thinking was that they would take stuff that already existed, make it better, and streamline the whole process so it worked faster. Right? An idea of what the Army and the rest of the military were thinking was in small arms. That is, as of in Korea, the United States typical small arm was something called the M4 carbine. It was carried by both the Army and the Marines. It was generally recognized that the M4 carbine was not good enough. It was inferior to what the Soviets were carrying, which was the AK-47. So various services had been talking about designing something to replace it for years. It never went anywhere. That is, each individual service wound up starting their own program to develop a replacement for the M4. They wound up caught up in their own service bureaucracies. 10 years later, it's 1960, they still don't have a new gun yet. In the meantime, American advisors went through South Vietnam and found that the South Vietnamese army was having a lot of trouble using M4s because South Vietnamese people were much smaller than Americans at the time due to inferior nutrition. The average South Vietnamese man was about 5'4". So they needed a much smaller, much lighter gun, right? One that would be more robust, that would survive harsh weather conditions. And the military had been stalling on developing this for years. It just got caught up in their bureaucracy. So ARPA stepped into the picture to try to speed things along. So they hired a gun designer to start from scratch and design a new weapon. This is it. It is called they called it the civilian version of this is the AR-15. They also developed a fully automatic version of this called the M16. Right? And it became the dominant American small arm for the next 50 years afterwards. By the way, one of the things about it was initially it was seen as a total fiasco. That is, the first M16s that were given to American soldiers in combat had a lot of trouble. The trouble was the manufacturer who made these for the Army and the Marines told them that the M16 was self-cleaning. For those of you who have experience with weapons, you know this not to be true. The Army and the Marines didn't, though. So they sent their M16s into combat to soldiers without any cleaning kits or instructions on how to clean them. So you would find in 1965 dead American soldiers with disassembled M16s by them, where they had the soldier had desperately taken it apart trying to figure out how to clean it after it jammed. Congress held committees on this. It was a big scandal. And then once they figured out that the weapons weren't self-cleaning, army started sending kits to their soldiers over how to clean them. They sent a comic book with instructions over how to do it. And for the next 50 years, the M16 was a very effective tool. The Soviet equivalent, the AK-47, was arguably more effective because it was more robust. That is, those, unless you use really crappy ammunition, really don't have to clean. If you take care of them all the last 50 years, no matter what the weather conditions are. However, if you've got the infrastructure in order to make sure the weapons are taken care of, the M16 is lighter, it delivers more firepower, was very effective. And this is what the military thought they were getting from ARPA. That is something that would just take science projects, technology projects that the military was working on anyway, and just get them to work better. That isn't what they got, though. What they actually got from ARPA was a lot more revolutionary. Right? That is, ARPA was the first head of ARPA was this man over here. His name was Herb York. If you've ever seen the movie Doctor Strangelove, Strangelove was modeled on York, right? That is, ARPA was run essentially by mad scientists. These were people who were, I guess a good word for it is defense sociopaths. That is the first wave of scientists who got involved with military operations. This is the guy who designed the Manhattan Project were kind of philosophers. That is, they designed weapons, but they also thought very deeply over their use. And they were very worried that atomic weapons would destroy the world. All those guys were purged out. What was left behind were people who thought of weapons and war as basically a cool project, a game. Right? So they designed weaponry and they designed systems to use weaponry without really any kind of moral compunction. They just wanted stuff that worked. This was either because they were hardline anti communists who thought that the defeat of communism was worth any sacrifice, or they were sociopaths, one way or the other. Okay? So you have this scientific group, this technological group, very smart people who don't have any limits. And to use the modern terminology, they wanted to disrupt war. That is, they thought that the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines were stuck in the past, that they were behind the times, that they had all kinds of new stuff and they didn't understand how to use it. So they wanted to go beyond what the military wanted. They wanted to invent something unimaginable. That is, they wanted to go beyond the limits of kind of the imagination of conventional people. So they were their first real test was the Vietnam War. That is, ARPA got to take their mad scientists and try to figure out ways, however, how to take the Vietnam War and make it winnable. Right? And their big project was how do you deal with the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Actually, if you look through their paperwork today, uh, most of even today, what they were thinking of doing is still classified. That is, it was never made public, even the ideas that they had. The handful of stuff that they were working on, though, that is unclassified, is really far out. And you can see uh, how bold and ambitious they were. And you can also see how the huge impact they had. And let's start with looking at the disruptive look at the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the Air Force wanted to bomb it. The Army wanted to send soldiers there in order to shut down the trail. The ARPA had other ideas. For one thing, they considered using atomic weapons to shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That is, they didn't think of big atomic bombs that would destroy cities. They thought that they could send in a bunch of little atomic bombs, send them to junctions around the trail where paths met each other, and make them radioactive. If those junctions were radioactive, then the communists couldn't use the trail anymore. Eventually, they concluded that this idea was unpractical. It was unpractical because, for one thing, They figured it would require somewhere in the neighborhood of 9,000 atomic bombs in order to do that. And also, they figured that once they made the trail radioactive, the communists would go into the forest and cut out a new trail. So then you'd need another 9,000 atomic bombs in order to make that trail radioactive. And this is what I mean. What they did not have limits. They were not bound by kind of conventional ideas over what you could do and what you couldn't do. Conventional ideas involving practicality or morality. They were going to be completely at loose. So if atomic bombs couldn't shut down the trail, then one could. Well, ARPA had an idea. They created a program called Operation Mosaic, right? Operation Mosaic's goal was to target the jungle that camouflaged the trail. That is, they went to the point where they thought they could change the weather of Southeast Asia. If they changed the weather of Southeast Asia, then you wouldn't get a jungle growing here anymore, and you would expose the trail. Right? This is against international law today, but it wasn't in 1962. Actually, if you look into the early 1960s, controlling the weather artificially was something seen as practical, as one of those future things like flying cars. How do you control the weather here? Well, you destroy the jungle. And as you're destroying the jungle, you also expose the trail. So, how do you expose the jungle? That is where Project Mosaic came in. Project Mosaic created a number of color coded defoliants designed to target the jungle. The best known of these is Agent Orange. Agent Orange was a defoliant created by, I believe, the Monsanto Corporation that was dropped over the jungles of Southeast Asia to try to get rid of the jungle. If they got rid of the jungle, then it would expose the trail network and the trails could be shut down. Agent Orange was highly effective. Okay? That is, this is an area before it got hit by Agent Orange. This is the same area afterwards. It is denuded of vegetation. They wound up destroying about a third of the forest of Vietnam by dropping Agent Orange on it. Right? So this was an out-of-the-box solution, and it was something that was very technically pursued. That is, what they came up with was very creative, a very effective use of chemistry, and on an operational level, it worked. It was around there to get rid of trees, it got rid of trees. However, the active ingredient in Agent Orange is something called dioxin. Dioxin is the most carcinogenic substance known to man. So if you happen to be standing under Agent Orange when it was dropped, you were in rough shape. This is a North Vietnamese soldier who was patrolling an area when the airplanes dropped Agent Orange on it. This is what he was looked like after it was done. Right? Not a particularly pleasant experience. The communist government in Vietnam estimated that they had 5 million casualties of the use of Agent Orange. The United States says that number is exaggerated, but we still, even today, don't really have a firm estimate on how many Vietnamese people wound up getting killed or got cancer as a result of this. We do know that a lot of American soldiers got dioxin poisoning. The Veterans Administration had cases involving dioxin that went on for years afterwards, cases involving Agent Orange. I had a friend of mine who actually got caught up in that. His father was in the Air Force in Korea. In 1968, he was stationed in Korea. And there was a band of guerrillas that came in from North Korea to attack the South Korean government. The president of South Korea lives in something called the Blue House, and they sent us a bunch of commandos to raid it. Those commandos wound up trying to hide in a forested area near an Air Force base. That was where my friend's father was stationed. His mother lived on the base too. In order to find those commandos, the Air Force dropped Agent Orange all around the base. My friend was conceived and was born on that base. And today he has something called Parkinson's syndrome. And he believes that the Parkinson syndrome was caused by the early exposure to dioxin. Whether that was true or not, we still don't know. For the dioxin from the Agent Orange. So you have all kinds of implications from the use of Agent Orange, but They did get rid of the trees. They did not shut down the trail, though, because although they were able to take out 1/3 of the jungle, the other 2/3 were still able to get materials through. So, although you have a very inventive program, one that was technically successful, it did not achieve the ultimate goal. Okay, it did not shut down the trail. It did not shut down the flow of supplies. And this, by the way, is a common theme that we're going to be seeing for the rest of the class. The United States is going to be doing things that are operationally successful, that show a great deal of professionalism, even shows things like creativity, technology, right? But they're not going to achieve the ultimate goal. Okay, they're not going to really make a difference in the winning of the war. So ARPA tries to destroy the forest in order to shut down the trail. It didn't work. So then ARPA has an idler idea. They decide that they're going to shut down the trail by building a wall. They called it McNamara's Wall. What the public was told was that the United States was going to build a wall from the Pacific to the Vietnamese Laotian border along this line. This was the border between North and South Vietnam. And the public was thinking in terms of a conventional wall. You have a wall in front of you, and by having that physical barrier, you could prevent the flow of people coming through. That was what the public was told. The actual project, though, was a lot more interesting, right? Because they did try to build a physical barrier. That was something that was done primarily for public relations. Nobody in the army thought a physical barrier would stop the flow of supplies to coming into the South Vietnam. But what was actually going on besides the scenes was an ARPA project, which was designed to build an electronic wall. By the way, the whole project was called McNamara's Wall after the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. The important part of the McNamara Wall was an electronic wall. That is, ARPA designed some sensor packages. These sensor packages were basically shaped like lawn darts. They would be dropped out of an airplane and they would stick into the ground like a lawn dart would. In the torpedo that was dropped, you would have a bunch of sensors. You would have a microphone, you would have a camera, you would have a heat detector, a motion detector, basically the stuff you would have in a security system today. Once those detectors gathered information, you had a antenna sticking up from basically the lawn dart. The radio transmitter in that antenna would send the information from the sensors to computers that would be behind the lines. The computers would then analyze the data and then from that would determine where the enemy was and how to stop their flow through into South Vietnam. If any of you have any relatives who were in the Army in 1967, 68, or in the Air Force, universally they hated Robert McNamara and thought this was a stupid idea. Right? Especially the Air Force. Air Force guys have heavy casualties on missions to drop these sensor packages. They thought the sensor packages were useless. However, by the mid 1980s, the Army concluded that McNamara's Wall was the most important innovation in war since the hydrogen bomb. Right? That is, what these guys were doing was very innovative. They were thinking basically 50 years ahead. Right? They were building a system of systems that would be worked by computers. Right? The computer itself had only existed for about 15 years. And the idea that you could have a computer and coordinate something this big was really bold. And they did it in the middle of a war and had the thing operational within a couple of years. It cost an enormous amount of money. That is, McNamara's Wall wound up costing the United States about $2 billion, making it the most expensive military research project since the development of the atomic bomb. In today's money, $2 billion would be worth about $25 billion, right? And even at the time, operationally, this thing was giving them a lot of useful information. For example, there was a battle at a place called Khe Sanh, where where the communists tried to attack an isolated Marine outpost. The Marines held on to Khe Sanh, though, and they concluded after the battle was over that they got about half of their targeting information from the sensor packages. However, these sensor packages in McNamara's wall was not good enough to win the war. It did not stop the flow of supplies coming into the South. Partially, this was because the sensors themselves weren't robust enough. That is, that they were not designed to survive in a jungle, which was what Vietnam was. So if you put them in heat, they quit working after a while. But the bigger problem was more conceptual. That is, computers were just new. They were trying to figure out how to do something extremely complicated with computers, uh, really for the first time ever. Which is why by the 1980s, the Army was reassessing it. They figured with better technology, with more experience, they could take the system and really make it work. And they used these types of packages extensively in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and didn't win there either. Right? So we'll get more into that towards the end of your class. But you're seeing a couple of methods designed to try to break the flow of supplies going south, to stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail, thereby ending the communist ability to fight the war. They tried bombing, it didn't work. They tried defoliants, it didn't work. They tried using electronic sensor packages, it didn't work. So the flow of supplies in the South Vietnam was never really interrupted. So the communists always had an ability to fight a war. They were outgunned by the American side and the American allies. That is, the Americans always had better firepower, but the communists had enough in order to keep the war going. They had a revolutionary people's war strategy. They had more than enough to keep that going indefinitely. So by the time you get in the mid 60s, it is apparent that the war in Vietnam is going to be a test of wills. Who is going to give up first? The communists or the Americans and their allies? Right? And in order to win that contest, the Americans basically relied on one strategy. The strategy is attrition. That is, they were going to launch attacks on the enemy without the idea that they were going to take a piece of land that would be significant. Right? Instead, they were going to attack the enemy with the idea that if they lost 10 guys in order to take a hill, the day was a success if the communists lost 100 guys. That is, attrition is the same thing that we heard in World War I. You want the other side to basically run out of supplies and manpower in order to continue the war. They couldn't cut the enemy off from supplies, but they could wear down the manpower. Right? So if they killed enough of the enemy, you wind up winning the war because the enemy does not have enough men to fight with. And even if you don't kill that many, if you kill enough of them, if you kill 10 enemy for every one of yours, 20 enemy for every one of yours, then maybe one day the enemy will say, screw this, we're losing too much, we give up. Right? So the United States is going to be following strategies, especially from the Army, designed to attrit the enemy, designed to create enemy losses. How do you do that? Well, one way is you send out what are called search and destroy missions. That is, they would send out patrols, basically with the idea that these patrols would get ambushed. Once the patrol got ambushed, you would know where the enemy was and they'd be fixed in position fighting your patrol. So then you use bombers and artillery in order to wipe out the enemy. You take advantage of your superior firepower in order to inflict casualties. Right? They had set up fire bases for artillery throughout the country and ranged pretty sections of the country so that they could call in artillery quickly. Americans dropped more bombs on South Vietnam than they did on all of Europe and Japan in World War II, as a way to destroy the enemy. Right? And to keep track of how they were doing, they ordered units to send in body counts. Right? That is, the units had a quota of how many enemy they had to kill that week, and they had to count up the bodies to say how many they actually accomplished. Right? Like most statistics, if you're relying on that, the statistics become bogus. There was an economist named Andrew Goodhart came up with something called Goodhart's Law. Goodhart's Law says if a measure becomes a target, it isn't a good measure anymore. That is, if you're giving people a quota of how many people they got to kill, how many people you kill no longer becomes an effective measure of how effective your army is. Right? It's a target that they are going to fill. That is, you talk to veterans from Vietnam, they will tell you how they shot cows and the like in order to fill up their quota because if they shot it up well enough, it would be enough to fit a body count. Or you could kill non-combatants, civilians even, right? So you have a search and destroy strategy that is coming up with numbers with the hope that this number would ultimately lead to something called the crossover point, a casualty number so high that the communists would say, we've had enough, we'll quit. So search and destroy tactics are one way to try to achieve that. And by the way, I've had veterans from Afghanistan tell me they did the same thing in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, though, they used a different name for it. They called it react to contact, I believe. And they don't do the body counts anymore. They don't say count up how many people you killed, I believe. Or at least they don't publicly release that number. They did that in the Vietnam War. If you watch the newscast every week, the Army would announce the body count, and the body count will be put on the news. Anyway, so tactics are one way that you could try to attrit the enemy, give them so many casualties that they're going to quit. But they also tried other ways that are innovative. Right? The most innovative thing they did in Vietnam was the use of psychology. Because they figured that psychology would enable them to manufacture a better soldier, a soldier that would kill more people. So if you send in smaller numbers, they would deal more damage. And, and this is an interesting idea. If any of you are into psychology, you ought to read this book. The book is called Men Against Fire. It was written by a man named S.L.A. Marshall. Marshall was a psychologist and historian in the Army during World War II. Right? So during the war, he traveled with units. So he would go to individual units as they stepped off the lines from combat. And he would do interviews with the people that were fighting. And once he got home, he would take out his notepad where he transcribed the interviews and try to draw conclusions from them. The main conclusion he drew was that only a minority of soldiers actually killed anybody. The number he came up with was 1 out of 4. Right? But his conclusion was that this was because people have an innate barrier to killing. Right? For most people, that means they would go up to the line, and if they fired their weapon at all, they would deliberately miss. They weren't cowards. They would try to do other things in order to support the unit, like bringing back ammunition, taking back wounded, so on and so forth. But they had an innate barrier from pulling the trigger at a human being. Only a handful of people did not have that barrier. Right? Sociopaths and psychopaths don't have that barrier, but those types of people make lousy soldiers. The people that he was interested in were people he considered natural soldiers. That is, these are people who can pull the trigger without feeling guilt, without hesitation, but who are functional human beings. That is, that they will follow orders, that they have an emotional connection with their comrades. Actually, he said that that emotional connection with the comrades was the primary thing that drove them, the integrity of the unit, the love between the people in the unit. Right? So psychologists look back at Marshall's conclusion, and psychology considers it very questionable. Particularly, the psychologists don't like his methodology. That is, today, psychology is about controlled experiments. It is deductive. That is, you designed an experiment, and you make sure that other variables aren't coming into it other than what you're studying. That wasn't what Marshall was doing. Marshall was doing was inductive, that he's going out in the field and doing interviews. He was very haphazard with how he kept his notes. So nobody can really reproduce his statistics. Right? So psychology looks at Marshall's conclusions and has real questions about them. History, however, does not, because what he's doing is what we do as historians. And whether it was a quarter, a third, an eighth of the men that were firing, his general idea seems pretty solid, which was that a minority was the people who were pulling the trigger. But what's really important is that the Army believed his conclusions. And because of this, the Army completely redid their training. Right? That is, Marshall and the Army believed that the way around this was to use a Skinnerian stimulus response method. Right? And if you've ever had any military training or any police training, you see how it works. That is, they want you to pull the trigger instinctively. That is, they relentlessly drill you until you shoot on, you react to contact. You just shoot on sight, shoot on movement without thinking about it. And you can see this also in other means of the training. If you were, say, going into riflery training in World War II, they would have had you shooting at a bullseye, a circular target. If you do it today, they have you shooting at a silhouette, a human-shaped target. A lot of police forces will even take pictures out of mugshots and stick them on the silhouette. That is, they want to get you used to the idea of shooting at a person. Right? They want that to become a reaction that you don't think about anymore. Right? So, because of this training, the U.S. Army went into Vietnam thinking that their soldiers were going to be much more lethal than the enemy. That is, an enemy that wasn't trained that way would have the innate uh, human hesitancy to fire. Their men would not. Right? And by the way, also, if you're into this idea, a Green Beret in Vietnam, a Army Special Forces man, I think his name was Grossman. Okay, after the war was over, got a psychology degree, and he wrote a follow-up book to Men Against Fire. He called it On Killing. He said that all of Marshall's conclusions were valid and tied it into kind of modern ideas such as post-traumatic stress. That's also an interesting book if you're into war or kind of into psychology. Anyway, so the Army was sending into combat a much better trained force, both in terms of better trained leaders, better trained men, and men who are psychologically primed to use their weapons. Their statistics estimated that in Vietnam, 55% of men in combat used their weapons and aimed them at the enemy. So they were hoping between all this stuff, their technology, their firepower, their aircraft, their artillery, their better infantrymen, that this would inflict more casualties on the enemy and break the enemy's will to fight. It didn't work. It worked in an operational sense. That is, the United States inflicted a lot more casualties than it endured. And it wasn't even close. The United States is going to have about 58,000 casualties in Vietnam. Enemy losses in conflict against the Americans was at least 10 times more, right? Possibly more than that. But they lost the war anyway. How do you lose the war when you're successfully killing more people than your enemy is, when your enemy is coming up against that kind of strain? Well, this is the enemy. What you're looking at here is a squad of National Liberation Front. Last time I thought who they were. These were South Vietnamese villagers who joined up with the communists and fought with them, in contrast to the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, right? Who came from the south, came from the north, were part of the regular North Vietnamese Army and fought against the Americans. If you look at this NLF unit, or Viet Cong, if you prefer to use that terminology, what stands out to you about them? Okay? A lot of people tell me that they are young. This is true. But also another thing about them is they don't stand out to anybody. And that is, if you'd have gone into any village everybody in the village would have looked like this. Right? That is, they would have been wearing the same clothing. Okay? Nothing about them would have stood out. Right? That is, the communists in Vietnam violated international law in that they had their soldiers not wear uniforms. International law says that soldiers have to wear uniforms in order to distinguish them from civilians. Right? The reason why they didn't was because of the reason why international law says they have to wear uniforms. If you can't tell the difference between a soldier and a civilian, you're going to kill a lot of civilians. Right? Remember, these soldiers came out of the villages. They had cells within the villages. They were using the villages in order to recruit. They were using the villages for supplies. So if you were coming after these men with a lot of firepower, the villages were going to get caught in the crossfire. Right? And when they did, right, this seriously harmed the American war effort. And by the way, the next picture I'm going to show you, once again, is going to be disturbing. A lot of disturbing pictures in this class. The next picture I'm going to show you is from 1971. Okay? A band of NLF ambushed an American unit near a village. So the American unit called in air support. The air support sent in bombers to take out the NLF unit. They missed and hit the village instead. They dropped onto the village napalm, which was jellied gasoline. What napalm does is it sticks to everything and burns. These are the villagers running away from the village, right? So if you lived in this village and you just got hit, who do you blame for this? Right? Do you blame the communists? That is, the people who you grew up with, who you know, who speak your language? Or do you blame the foreigners, the people who don't speak your language, the people who are pushing buttons from 35,000 feet? Right? That is the huge flaw in what the Americans were doing. That is, any American use of firepower is going to get civilians caught in the middle of it. There was no intent on going in there and massacring civilian populations in Vietnam. That is, this wasn't the German army in Russia. However, if you are using a lot of firepower against an enemy that is intermixed with civilians, and your weaponry isn't all that accurate, you're going to have a lot of civilians dead. And when those civilians are dead, this is going to wind up strengthening the will of the enemy to continue. That is, basically, if you were in a communist-run village, every day was 9/11. A bunch of foreigners came in and killed your people for nothing. Right? So as the Americans use firepower, the communists get more recruits. They wind up replenishing their ranks. And they're not going to run out of men to continue the fight. And their will to continue the fight just gets stronger and stronger. Now, with that, it's only a matter of time. It's a matter of time until the Americans give up. And what is going to make the Americans give up is that communist strategy, Revolutionary People's War, because it is steadily inflicting violence on American soldiers. Americans are enduring casualties in drips and drabs. These are starting to build up. And these are ultimately going to erode the will of the American public to continue the war. Right? Because the war did not end the way the communists thought. The communists believed that using this strategy would break the will of the American army to continue the war. That is, they thought that the American soldiers would get so demoralized they would just throw down their weapons and run away. That never happened. But the United States at home, the public, was another story. That is, as the casualties built up, the public's endurance for continuing the war wore away. And this chart shows you that. That is, the dots here in blue were done in a book called Public Opinion and the Presidency. I forget who wrote it, but it was published in 1971, I believe. What the author did in that book was he drew up a chart where he graphed the American military casualties in Vietnam against the net public support for the war in Vietnam. That is, he went to the Gallup poll that asked the question, do you think the United States should be in Vietnam, yes or no? Right? He subtracted yes for no to get no from yes to get net public support. Right? And he put the military casualties on a logarithmic scale. That is, he figured the first casualty is going to be traumatic. The second one, less so. They get the same emotional impact of the first, then 10 people got to die. Once 10 people die, then 20 won't be that big of a deal. So to get that same emotional impact, you got to get to 100, then 1,000, then 10,000, then 100,000, so on and so forth. So if you make that graph, this is what you get in these blue lines. That is, the high point of American public support was 1965, when the United States got into the war. The government said this was necessary for the worldwide campaign against communism. There was broad public support for that idea. But as the casualties built up, support for the war declined. Till you get to about 1967. Then in 1967, the government launched a major public relations campaign. They sent what they called truth squads throughout the country to remind the people of the country what the war was about. It was part of the war against communism. If you don't defeat communism in Vietnam, you'll have to fight them someplace else, sometime else. That effort was very successful, and they were able to rebuild public support for the war. But it only worked for a while. Then public support started to decline again. Until by the time you get to 1971, public support for the war in Vietnam was evaporated. There was much more Americans wanted to leave Vietnam than to stay, so no American government could stick around in Vietnam for long. Right? And if you look at that chart over here, compare it to this one here in red. The one here in red was made by me in 2007. That is, I took that same methodology and applied it to the war in Iraq. And if you compare the red dots to the blue dots, you see that they are parallel to each other. That is, the public support for the war in Iraq was declining at exactly the same rate as public support for the war in Vietnam. Right? That could just be a coincidence, or it could see something deeply psychological about American culture. But no matter how that worked, if you are the American military, a war is a ticking clock. It's the ticks are your casualties. At a certain point, you will be the one that will pass the crossover point. You will have so many casualties that your public will no longer want to continue the war. And when you've reached that point, it's game over. You're going to have to bring your troops home. They found that out in Vietnam. They found that out in Iraq. Looks like they're finding that out in Afghanistan too. Right? So if you put all that together, you have basically what went on in the 1960s. The reasons why the Americans could not win this war. However, as you get into the late 60s and early 70s, the military started trying stuff that was new. At the time, it wasn't enough to change the dynamic because by the time they're starting this, public support for the war was already so low they don't have time to work anything. But the military got from this a number of ideas, and they thought that if they ever fight a war like this again, they could use some of those ideas and they will turn out into a different result. So I want to show you kind of the things they were coming up with towards the end. Right? This, by the way, is the end. Let's start with this guy here. His name is Creighton Abrams. Creighton Abrams became the principal American military commander in Vietnam in 1969. And he came up with a new plan to fight the Vietnam War. It involved the building of something called strategic hamlets. Because what they did was they said that the key to the war were the villages. Right? That you had to go into those villages and protect the villagers from the rebels. That is, the villagers were afraid of the rebels, so they were supporting the rebels. So you had to prove to the villagers that they were safe, that you could protect them. Right? And you had to keep the villages away from the rebels, away from the villages, so that the rebels couldn't go into the villages, get supplies, get reinforcements. So how they did that was they took the villages, tore them down, and rebuilt them. They then surrounded the new villages with barbed wire, right? Creating a strategic hamlet. The barbed wire would have the new village would have limited entry, so they could keep the rebels out, and they could keep the people within the village safe. They were doing this too late to really change how the war was going, but uh, by the end of the war, the army thought this idea was very promising, and they thought that they would have applied this from the beginning, that the war would have turned out differently. Okay. However, later experience, and also if you look into, like, say, Iraq or Afghanistan, you could see these general concepts applied. In 2006, a general named David Petraeus took over in Afghanistan. He was a military intellectual. That is, he read a lot of history and thought that this is applicable to current events. He was big into what Abrams was doing at the end of the war, so he tried to apply it himself, which led to the policy called the surge. The surge was the same general idea, only without the fence. You put a group of soldiers into a civilian population to show the civilians that they can be protected, so they don't have to support the rebels out of fear. Right? That they didn't try that until 2006 tells you a lot about the American government that went into Iraq, one of the reasons why it was so ineffective. However, uh, military people, especially by the time you get to 2006, 7, 8, believed that this was a plan that would work. The reality is not really that optimistic. Okay, for one thing, if any of you remember the Spanish American War, the Spanish tried the same thing in Cuba. They called it the Concentrado Plan. Right? That is, that the only real difference between the Concentrado and this is the name. Right? Between the surge in this is the fence. That is, they wouldn't build a fence around it. But if you're one of those villagers, is that fence there to keep the enemy out or to keep you in? Are you being a protected or are you a prisoner? And what the military was believing might not necessarily be what the villagers were thinking. And also, right, when another basic flaw in this assumption is it's kind of missing the point of Revolutionary People's War. Remember, the Revolutionary People's War, the idea was to start from the villagers out. So if you lock up the villagers behind a fence, you're locking up everybody who is a communist with the hardcore guys. Basically, you could think that this camp would work like the Texas prison system, where a bunch of gangsters are all basically tied up together, are chained up together. You got guards around them, but those guards can't really control what's going on the inside. And so, whether or not the strategic hamlet was an idea that would work, the army believed it leaving Vietnam. The results after Vietnam aren't conclusive, but they're not optimistic either. Second thing that was being tried during Vietnam is something I think is really interesting. It was an idea developed by this man here. His name is J.C.R. Licklider. Today, J.C.R. Licklider is kind of known among computer geeks. That is, he was somebody who worked for DARPA, okay, the Advanced Research Project Administration, and he had an idea that in the event of nuclear war, you should have a decentralized computer system so that the computer network would survive the war. So he designed it and it was built. It was called ARPANET. That was the basically the origin of the modern internet. So basically, what you're looking at in J.C. Licklider was the guy who invented the internet. However, during Vietnam, he did something different. That is, he ran a program in neighboring Thailand where he told the Thai army, This program was designed to design uniforms for Thai soldiers. So when the Thai recruits came in to be fitted for their uniforms, they would be given a questionnaire. That is, they'd be asked where they were from, they'd be asked about their families, and all that information would be taken. What they didn't tell Thailand or the soldiers who were giving him information was that they didn't give a rat's ass about uniforms. Why they were there was to get that information from those Thai people. They were then going to put it into computers. And then after the fact, they would see which of those Thai people who came in, those Thai draftees who came in to be fitted for uniforms, would turn communist. They can then have computers analyze all of the demographic data that they had collected on them in order to try to draw up equations that would tell them who the person was most likely to be a communist so they could preemptively do things like arrest them. This idea was done on a small scale during the Vietnam era. It is done on a large scale today. What I just described was the entire business model of Amazon.com, right? Or of Spotify. That is, that they get your demographic information, they keep statistics over what you're doing, and then use computers to process it all in order to try to predict your future behavior. They do that in advertising. They do that when they send out emails telling you that something they think you want to buy is now on sale. Basically, the entire modern economy, the whole ideas behind the modern kind of Silicon Valley use of data came out of this guy's attempts in Vietnam. So if you can use those successfully, you could totally revolutionize warfare, he figured. Right? So you got a couple of new ideas that are being tried on a small scale towards the end of the war. You have the strategic Hamlet. You got this, today they would call it analytics, the use of data. And you've got more accurate weaponry. Right? In the early 1970s, the United States created something brand spanking new in the world. It was called the Global Positioning System, or GPS for short. This is something that probably would surprise most of you because everybody in here takes GPS for granted. But there was a time in the not too distant past where GPS didn't exist, where GPS was actually unimaginable. GPS was created for military purposes. That is, once the GPS satellites are in orbit, they military created new explosives that they called precision guided munitions, or PGMs for short. Usually in the press, they're referred to as spark bombs. The military is hoping that these bombs would be far more accurate than the stuff that they dropped in the past. And indeed, they were very successful. For example, the Air Force had been trying to hit this bridge in in Hanoi for 8 years during the war. They could never get it. Right? However, once they started using the smart bombs, they were able to wipe it out in 2 bombing raids. Right? And today, the precision guided munition has evolved a great deal. In 1965, an accurate bomb would land somewhere between a half mile radius of where you were aiming at. Today, by the 1990s, sorry, that is down to 30 yards. So today's weaponry is far more accurate. So if you get far more accuracy, if you're aiming at a person hiding among civilians, you're going to have far fewer civilian casualties. You could inflict pain on the enemy soldiers without inflicting it on the enemy civilian population, thereby driving up the enemy's will to fight. Right? So you have a number of new ideas that are coming in at the end of the Vietnam War that the military was very hopeful would change the way war would work in the future. However, we're looking back in 2020, we fought 2 wars since then. Neither one of them turned out well. Right? Which is where I want to leave your class. Because if you are the American military, what you're seeing here is a giant failure. Right? And it is a giant failure that for years you have misinterpreted. That is, if you talk to any Army people, say 1990, 2000, they would have blamed the Vietnam War on politicians. They would have said the wrong people were running the war effort. They would have blamed it on the media. That is, the media was sending back stories that were undermining support for the war in America. And if they ran the war right, then they would have won. By Iraq, they got their chance. That is, they got the guy in charge of the American government that they wanted, George W. Bush. When they went to war in Iraq in 1991 and then again in 2003, they shut out the media. Media did not have free access to those countries. That is, they could not go anywhere they wanted, like they were in Vietnam. Instead, they were embedded into military units where the military could control what they saw. Right? You had a deliberate attempt to try to sanitize the war in Iraq. That is, that they wouldn't, among other things, show any pictures at all of American military funerals. They didn't release any body counts. They didn't release military casualties. But none of that made any difference. The war turned out exactly the same. Right? What the problem of the United States was basically conceptual, a problem of imagination. That is, ARPA was right. These guys were stuck in the past. They were confronting a strategy, Revolutionary People's War, that they did not have a solution for. The things they were trying didn't work. Okay? Even without the media, it didn't work. And the innovations that came in during Vietnam didn't make much of a difference either. That is, they put in sensors. They used precision guided munitions that radically cut down on casualties, especially civilian casualties. Uh, they used statistics, they used analytics, and the actual results of the war did not work anyway. And this is an important thing because the standard technique used to fight against the United States is a Revolutionary People's War. So at some point, some American military leader has to figure out a way in order to handle it. They couldn't do that for Vietnam, and we shall see in the future what they can come up with when the United States has to do this again. In the meantime, American public had had enough of the Vietnam War by 1973. So in the Christmas of 1972, the United States and North Vietnam signed an agreement where they agreed to pull American military troops out of Vietnam. By 1973, they're gone. Once the American soldiers are gone, the communists in Vietnam went into stage 3 of Revolutionary People's War. That is, they formed their guys into big units and started to knock off the anti-communist government's positions one by one. By 1975, by the spring of 1975, the anti-communist government's resistance is collapsing. Right? And in April and May of 1975, the anti-communist government fell. These are civilians that were associated with the United States being evacuated on helicopters from the embassy in South Vietnam. They would wound up being brought into aircraft carriers, would be taken out. Hundreds of thousands of others, however, were left behind. Life did not turn out too well for them because once the communists took over in Vietnam, they took hundreds of thousands of people that they associated with the former government and threw them into prison camps, where many people wind up being incarcerated up until the 1980s. Right? In neighboring Cambodia and Laos, it went even worse. In Cambodia, a communist group called the Khmer Rouge came to power. They were led by a psychopath named Pol Pot, who said that the way to make a revolution work is to completely destroy the old society. How do you destroy the old society? You destroy everybody who kept the old culture, right? Which was basically anyone with an education. By the time the Khmer Rouge was done, they killed 1 million people in a country whose population was only 5 million people. And it's one of the greatest genocides in the history of the world. In Vietnam, it did not turn out as bad, but hundreds of thousands of people fled Vietnam, okay, because either they feared persecution under the communist government or because the economic system under communism was so bad. They were called the boat people because many of them went on boats and went into other places in Southeast Asia. About 500,000 of the boat people wound up re-immigrating into the United States. In Houston, we have a large Vietnamese population that descends back from it. Others wound up in refugee camps in places like the Philippines and Hong Kong, and a lot of them are still there today. Right? So that is the Vietnam War. And with that, let me go ahead and end this subject.